We're going to get started. Hi, I'm Peter Hirschberg, and this is a really fun topic, this bit about maker cities, because, I mean, seriously, the topic didn't exist a couple of years ago, and yet it brings together two of these great trends of the era, the fact that everybody's moving back together to cities, and the fact that we have agency and that we're creating things. And this leads to a really interesting question of what is the definition of a maker city. When Dale asked me to put this talk together, I went out and I spent some time at Pittsburgh and in Oakland. I went to New York. I went off to Las Vegas. And I think there's three definitions of this before we get into it. If you're the Obama administration, a maker city for you is the hopeful possibility of more jobs. It expands out the tech economy to be something that includes people who are skilled and work with their hands and the ability to make things. And it's the possibility of bringing the supply chain back. And a lot of interesting work's going on in that respect. The whole other aspect of Maker City is really the civic innovation part of Maker City. It's the idea that kind of all of us actually have a big hand in co-creating our city, whether it's through the open data movement or the urban prototyping movement, but it's the idea that cities are going to be built with us. But I think underlying all of this, there's almost a spiritual dimension, which is in the maker age, when people have the agency and the ability to create things, and they don't need permission, and stuff isn't manufactured for them. When you translate that into a city and democracy, it gets really interesting. Well, one way of asking where a maker city is to go to Nick Pinkston's blog when he put up a map of where are there hardware meetups. And you can actually see that you have a lot of the manufacturing centers of the Midwest. You have New York, you have San Francisco, you have Las Vegas. Noticeably, Los Angeles was missing from there. But I think one interesting way of looking at this is that just like cities have traditionally been about coming together, maker cities are jazz cities. When I say jazz cities, I say that's because the maker movement is about combining materials, combining disciplines, combining ideas, and combining people. And this is exactly what went on about 100 years ago during the second industrial revolution in New York, because not only were we manufacturing things, but we had all of these influences flowing in. We had kind of the African-American migration up from the South. We had people coming in from Eastern Europe. And in that great melting pot, jazz was literally created and ideas flowed. And that's particularly what's able to happen today with software and now with material. So it's no surprise to see that New York has become a great maker city. Here is New York Polytechnic in Brooklyn, and my friend Luc Dubois teaches there. Now, Luc teaches there everything from a computer gaming lab to soft materials to Fab Lab stuff. He has fashion students who come in and learn gaming and go off and then do wearables. People who are working in the sensor routine or understanding sensors or new materials are working on projects that will actually help go build a smart city. It's a remarkably interdisciplinary place. And one of the things you find is that the Maker City disrupts education, and it's a very interdisciplinary movement. Here is one of the labs there. This is actually in the computer gaming lab. New York is a fascinating place to look at because all of the influencers that are there start to influence them, show up kind of in the maker arena. So in addition to maker spaces that are working in new hardware materials or software, a very rich, because New York has the fashion industry, a whole bunch of maker sewing places. So this is the Textile Arts Center. And in Brooklyn, don't let anyone tell you shoes aren't made in America. This is Brooklyn Shoe Space, which is a maker space for people who are kind of in the fashion industry. And there are a bunch of, turns out, startups. So a classic maker startup is my friend Nora's company, Collabra. So Collabra is an online marketplace where you can put your designs, you can purchase the material you need to do, you can share ideas. It's a classic example of what Kevin Kelly was talking about yesterday. What's different about today's maker movement than before? Well, it turns out that designs that people who sew make, user-generated designs are outselling the designs made by professional companies. And people want to get together and collaborate and build these things together in studios, and that's creating a business for her. And I caught up with Nora and I asked her both why New York, and also what was unique about what she was up to.
I call it conspicuous production. So people moved on from conspicuous consumption to conspicuous production. They don't want to just purchase and
mass-produced items. They want to have something unique, something customized. They want to see where does something come from. They want to know the origin. It's about origin and transparency. What's good about New York is that there's so many other industries that can actually subsidize you, or you can make a living and start something by the side and then grow into something bigger.
You know, what's fascinating about the New York economy is there's so many industries there, and each one is kind of finding its maker complement, whether it's food or light industry or the textile world. New York, of course, also, like so many cities today, is a frontier. It has kind of a portion of the town that was discarded, and there's huge energy there now and coming back. So Brooklyn's practically a cliche now, but if you take a close look at what's going on in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the way that manufacturing comes together with incubators, with economic development, it's a lovely example. And it's one that's just becoming right now.
New York City has been working to redevelop the Brooklyn Navy Yard, bring it back to life, recreate it as a home for good-paying industrial jobs.
What I have seen in the last 10 years is just mind-boggling. A lot of local, state, and federal dollars have been poured into the Navy Yard's infrastructure to make it what it looks like today.
What you have is manufacturing the traditional sense of making things, but it's being combined with high-end design, with new technology, with art, woodworking, metalworking.
Currently, the Navy Yard has 275 businesses, and we've created about 6,400 jobs.
We're doing a project called the New Lab. We're creating spaces which will be shared by a whole series of innovative companies based around rapid prototyping, new manufacturing, and 3D printing. We're hoping just to become a catalyst that'll spawn a whole slew of different types of economic innovation.
Living in the neighborhood and seeing the Navy Yard coming alive and having job opportunities, I'm just excited.
For the city, these kinds of jobs are critical to creating stable middle-class communities.
Brooklyn is the place to be right now. It's coming up. It's coming up.
If any of you are tweeting the opportunities that present themselves with new microphone and sound amplification technology, the possibility of building fail-safe audio is upon us. You know, in New York, like so much in this movement, it was always thus. And 100 years ago, New York also had making on the mind at the great, thank you, at the great America's Making Exposition of 1921 at the 71st Regiment Armory. Now, the reason making was on their mind back then is the big problem in America 100 years ago was we were a melting pot. People were coming in from all over the world, and the essential social problem was how do you get everybody to kind of speak a common language or feel like they're in community? It was the New York version of the growing pains that San Francisco is going through right now. And what the city fathers of New York realized is it was the making tradition that people came from that ought to be celebrated. So in this exhibition, and if you went through this book, through 100 pages, we have like the Italians are making things and the Yugoslavs are making things. And it goes on and on. But what it shows is that this great diversity and melting pot that is America kind of celebrated this back then. And then we kind of went through the mass industrial era and we're kind of back. So maker cities, I think, are also inclusive cities, and they have a story to tell, and they're learning cities. When I say they have a story to tell, you know, in the software world, everybody wanted to be Silicon Valley, and because software culture was new, you know, it's kind of like, how does each city interpret itself? But every city has some manufacturing or making background, and so as they reinvent themselves, you see authenticity in the city story pop up. And that's in no place more true than in Pittsburgh, which, like so many cities, has literally become a maker city and also a green city. So here's contemporary Pittsburgh. One of the interesting things about Pittsburgh is the way that you see hardware accelerators and when I was out there recently and walking around Carnegie Mellon, the thing that you find in all of these cities is people come in and they get so excited about either the ecosystem or the possibility of creating stuff there that they're kind of thrilled not to leave. I mean, you see this in Las Vegas, you see this here. I went and I visited Alpha Lab, which is, it was a regular accelerator, became a hardware accelerator, and now it's kind of sitting there at the core of the supply chain in Pittsburgh.
Alpha Lab is a program we started 5 years ago. We take a group of companies twice a year, and we bring them into our space on the south side, and we surround them with mentors, educational programming, a lot of networking connections, and also investment.
The thing that really strikes me is the interconnectedness and the support that everybody gives to one another within that community.
One of the latest demonstrations that you can set up a manufacturing supply chain and do it all right here in Western Pennsylvania.
What we do is we manufacture devices that capture 3D models of anything, whether it be a human body part or reverse engineering a turbine blade. Anything that requires a physical model to be converted to a digital realm, we can do. We're now the largest manufacturer of scanners by volume in the country and one of the top 3 in the world. And it really, frankly, was because of the focus that IW gave to the plan and the shift in strategy for us.
One of the things you find is that you can't make a maker city by putting a fab lab in, but when you put in the infrastructure and people start to build out the ecosystem, the supply chain starts to build up itself. Pittsburgh also is an example of inclusiveness. This is the Makership Project. So it's a new take on an internship and apprenticeship. The idea is if skilled labor had apprenticeships, now they can be more open. And in a project being led by Bernie Lynch, working with the Department of Labor to actually come up with a maker label as a Department of Labor kind of trained job description to make it easier to get jobs. And one of the things that this project is doing is bringing in people who are either not yet skilled or perhaps coming off of being a veteran and bringing new people into the workforce and lays out kind of a set of skills you could learn. This is Ezra, who was unemployed, moved to Pittsburgh, heard about this, learned a set of skills, classic things like Arduino and working with new sets of tools, and is now able to get employed. And you see this idea of people teaching each other all over the place. One of the great examples is Mark Roth in San Francisco, who was homeless and then found Tech Shop.
My name is Mark Roth. I'm the founder of the Learning Shelter, and basically what we're trying to do is take the learning and education model into the homeless shelters and make a deep impact on homelessness. I decided to create the Learning Shelter. It's a 90-day live-in program that takes people out of the homeless shelters and then teaches them the skills that they need in order to go out and find jobs. I found a community, it's called the Maker Community, and I became a part of it, and I learned as much as I could, as fast as I could. Between 6 months and a year and a half, I went from being homeless to being able to just barely support myself to founding and running a business that's actually doing quite well. We're going to go out and we're going to source people who need new skills, and we're going to bring them in and we're going to teach them those skills. They're everything from 3D printing to making t-shirts. When they walk out of the Learning Shelter, they're going to have the basic understanding of how to use this stuff to get a job.
In Las Vegas, Qualifier is a startup that's trying to make up for where you may not need college. So they take high school students, match them up with the skills of companies, and create competitions. The woman who ran it used to run the X Prize. One thing you see a lot in maker cities is, of course, hacking education. The idea that we're moving to a world that if you have a portfolio and a set of skills, that's what you need to show. WorkHands is a San Francisco startup. Think of it as a LinkedIn for blue-collar individuals, because if you're a maker, you want a profile where you can actually show your work and the quality of the things you can do, what union might be part of or what you've worked on. And in just a few months, they have got 10,000 people who've signed up, about 1,000 or so job posts, and a SaaS client for people who are going through apprenticeships. So you actually see the startup community being able to respond in this arena. Maker communities also have, or maker cities are also about agency. People often say civic innovation, but it's the sense that actually I'm not a consumer, I can get something done around here. One of my favorite examples comes from Dallas, and Jason Roberts, who lived in a suburb, went to Europe and noticed that his suburb had tracks for a trolley, but the trolley had been taken away. There was no transportation, and so he just started the Oak Cliff Transit Authority. He had no permission to start the Oak Cliff. And he wanted to raise $60 million to build a transit system, and they told him, no, it's just not how it works. But then when the transit system bond actually failed in Dallas, he then raised the money and he built the transit system. Very much of a maker instinct. Now, I was so inspired by this, I realized we needed a San Francisco Urban Prototyping Authority, and I realized that I could be commissioner. So we actually did this. The Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, which is an arts organization that I chair, worked together with 5M, a real estate developer, and Tech Shop, And a couple of years ago, we had the Urban Prototyping Festival. The idea was take this great space. The tech shop is in and a number of startups are in. The developer of that space wants to develop 4 acres, but was thinking, what could this 4 acres be? Let's turn to makers. So we had a contest. We cataloged every part of the town. People came in, they built stuff, had tech shop, and they imagined things. For example, in San Francisco, you can't park a car at a fire hydrant, but you might be able to make a park. There's 10 miles of possible little gardens there. Could you turn the steps into a musical instrument? One person created this thing. It turns your heartbeat into music. And I thought that was a cool little maker project. But Mayor Menino in Boston ordered up a dozen of them so that they could make that a more engaged city. One of the problems that this development has is this part of town is very dark, and there's kind of a tunnel, and they want to maintain the tunnel, and the planning department was like, we're not sure that would work. So the whole thing was turned into a whole fanciful question of what would the development look like if you had a dark area, but you used projections to turn it into other spaces. So this is kind of like a bottom-up addition to city planning, and the planning department actually found it completely delightful and is now working. Increasingly, we have this notion that when a project is in its entitlement period, makers come in and activate a space. And this has become kind of a serious thing. The Institute for the Futures has a major Maker Cities project going on, and there's a game where people all over the world are coming up with alternative futures. And these aren't just ideas, because in a Maker City, a maker hacks the law. So in San Francisco, Rebar created a new permit type, which was the parklet. You see these all over the place. My friend Michael Yarney at a group that I'm on the board of called Up Urban is now creating a new form of business improvement district law so that people in a neighborhood can go out, self-tax themselves, put in their own authority, and go solve a problem, in this case, putting in green infrastructure and parks. But the idea is you can actually start to play with the legal system. When you read comments about this, people are saying, well, when they build their own thing and they tax themselves and it's so efficient because it turns out it's transparent and has accountability and you see what's going on, you start to see maybe the regular government may not be as accountable and sufficient. And that's one of the great things about this movement. And this law was recently passed, and it's something that's going to happen here. The Maker City is certainly a laboratory. Now, we hear this notion of a city as a laboratory. Sometimes you can do this as a guerrilla, and sometimes it requires the city to just like shut up, reduce permitting requirements, and let you experiment for a couple of years. That's a little difficult for San Francisco to do, but Paris does a really good job of it, and here's their deputy mayor.
We have also created a living lab. The Paris Region Lab is the backbone of our success. This is the cartography of all the experimentation we have already launched in Paris. I think we have more than 100 experimentations which have been launched since 2009.
This was really great. So one thing was make street furniture. They relaxed the permitting constraints and people started building stuff. Another was do green infrastructure. You see this in in enterprise zones, but the idea of relax the permits and let makers make is a really big theme. And then you can go to places where it's just easy, because you see a Maker City is a frontier. I think this is a really interesting concept because America loves a frontier. I mean, this city was all about pioneers going out with rugged individualism and getting something done. And you can argue when we run out of frontier as a nation, our national character gets ornery and we get unhappy and like it's not so great. So I think one of the great things about Maker Cities is we are discovering a frontier and the American dream. And we've always had our frontier in the most unusual places, which is why I always think one of the most unusual Maker Cities is Las Vegas and what Tony Hsieh is doing in downtown Las Vegas. You know, when you first hear he's spending $350 million to make this the next great entrepreneurial Maker City, you're like, Las Vegas, that can't be. But it turns out it's one of the most pleasant small towns there is, because his whole focus is on this other great notion of cities, that when you bring people into cities and there's density, they learn faster, they become smarter. It's this whole notion of the incubator. And that's being pursued diligently. In fact, to the point that he's measured, if you get 2.3 collisionable hours per square foot a year, you're driving innovation. Now, and there's actually a city science team that's measuring this and trying to replicate it. It's kind of modeled after campuses. You find co-working spaces all over town to kind of drive innovation. If you go to Tony's apartment, people are brainstorming on what that city might look like. There are hardware startups, and kind of tech companies, but also lots of small businesses that are replacing kind of the older businesses with, in this case, here's a woman who always wanted to have a clothing store. Her clothing store is really a place to meet and hang out to drive collisions in addition to being a clothing store. One of my favorite startups that hasn't even been announced yet is a new factory in Las Vegas. It's focused on how do we build between 200 and 100,000 of something. That's the classic hole in the maker manufacturing movement. So they're putting a lot of money into a cell that does plastic, circuit boards, and metal. And this comes from a whole bunch of hardware startups that basically realized that was the big hole. So it's exciting to see a place, Las Vegas in America, invest in this. And then the rest of the city picks up other cues. This is a container park. The container park has all sorts of temporary space, but one of the great ideas is if you have an idea for retail, you can get in at a lease that's just weeks long, test it, and if that works, move on. Because a maker city is a prototype city, and this is actually embodying that. There's some nice cues from Burning Man because you want a city that's immediate and fun. I love the fact that it's not really a smart city, it's a city that makes you smarter. As I wrap up, Jane Jacobs famously talked about the fact that a real city is only one that can be co-built by you. But she also had this great line, by its nature, the metropolis provides what otherwise could be given only by traveling, namely the strange. Which brings us really to what I think is the greatest maker city on earth.
The place is an idea. That's so powerful and so alluring that people will go to the worst place in the world just to get a little taste of it.
You know, the great thing about Burning Man is it's a concept car. It's not street legal. You know, it's like you wouldn't want to build one of those near city, but the ideas are so remarkably transportable, and I think that community has such rehearsal in making things that when you look at the principles of Burning Man, you actually realize they can be the principles for your city. 3 of them are about the individual, 3 are about how you build a community, and a couple are about the economy. But these are really principles of immediacy and of agency and of co-creating. And I got so interested in this, I'm just finishing up a book with some folks at the Media Lab called From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond, looking at these principles of emergence in cities. So I want to wrap up out here in California, the land of the free and the home of the strange, in deference to Jane Jacobs. We know a lot about the maker movement here. One of my favorite places out here is in Oakland. It's American Steel, and it's actually the place where a lot of the artists that work at Burning Man have come together, but that has actually stimulated the manufacturing economy in Oakland. I went out and I talked to the head of American Steel and also to the woman who runs Flux Foundation there.
American Steel Studios is 6 acres in size. We have 170 tenants doing everything from large-scale sculpture, fire art, art cars, to jewelry, glasswork, lighting, fashion, and furniture design, painting, photography. The best commodity of American Steel, I would say, is its community and the skill set here. Rebecca Peters has a vintage printing press. If her press needs a repair, she knows that someone out here can weld it back together for her. In 2005, I needed a space to make a tall, heavy sculpture. And this building is outfitted with bridge cranes that can lift 10 tons, and it has really high ceilings, so it was a perfect place for me to get started. Over time, other artists became aware of the space and the infrastructure, and there became this sort of need or desire for people to be here. We are in West Oakland. It's the largest district of Oakland. There's so much diversity. We have industrially zoned land, commercial land, residential land. So you've got all these mixed uses kind of happening in the same space. And it's sort of come to be called the industrial art corridor.
One of the biggest parts of doing the work we do, doing the art we do, is that the process of making is really, really kind of fundamentally our biggest focus. And we want that art experience, the making experience, to be accessible by more and more people. We're really giving people permission to kind of step in and do something they didn't expect they could.
Most of all, The Maker City is clearly something that's intentionally made. It's not done by the government for you. There's all of this activity going on. I don't think I had a sense of all of this energy and how hopeful it was until I kind of went off and started preparing for this. I went off looking at Maker Cities, and what I think I ran into was the American dream, in the sense that so many deeply American values are here. This is about community, maker spaces. When Tocqueville said that association is the mother of all science, he must have had in mind every incubator and every maker space where people are associating. These notions of agency and taking responsibility for things and building stuff up, so different, and also the possibility of inclusiveness. If in fact, as is being done in Pittsburgh, you can bring, and in San Francisco and so many places, of multiple walks of society together, that's a very hopeful economic story. And it's just the beginning. This is the kind of story that, like, next week it's completely different, because so much is going on that we're all going to go create, in addition to creating even better microphones. Thanks very much. Yes, we can take some questions. Well, you know, there's all of this impact that shows that when you bring people together and let them have the ability to share ideas and collide, cities, like the bigger a city gets, it's something like when every doubling it's like 15% smarter and greater economic output. And that's exactly the stuff that Tony Hsieh is basing his work on. And so, I mean, one way of looking at it is just, you know, the economics behind any of these kind of incubator movement. I think then the other question is, to what degree are maker things economically contributing? And I think there you have to look at, you know, it begins to go from people who are manufacturing and building prototypes, then you start going to companies that are doing small runs, and then on up to manufacturing. And you see a number struggling with that right now. For example, as I visited startups, almost every startup that you visit that's working on something, it's kind of like 4 people. There's like kind of 3 software people and the guy who goes to Shenzhen. Because, you know, VCs like to fund things that scale, so a lot of that's not being captured. So, you know, you can measure the startup activity, but not necessarily the manufacturing stuff. And that stuff, those are the kinds of things that Lemnos Labs is working on and that in Las Vegas is working on. But I think the best research is if you go to the downtown Las Vegas site, Tony Hsieh is just, he's just emphatic about measuring things. And we'll do one more question. Yes. Yes, and then we're done.
I was wondering about small cities and more rural locations. I live in a place that's got 100,000 residents, and can't get anywhere else very easily.
Right.
Have you seen other communities?
Okay, so 2 thoughts on this. One, I think this is great news for smaller cities because a lot of the largest cities are pricing themselves out. And so, you know, this may not be the smallest ones, but this is particularly great news for, you know, places like Cleveland and Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and like kind of everywhere that isn't San Francisco, New York, and LA. I think the big thing that drives this is creativity. I mean, I was reading that, where is it in South Dakota where Mount Rushmore is? A small town in the New York Times today, a very creative city. I think it's not so much size, it's can you get that kind of creative economy spark going? Because at the end of the day, cities are competing with each other. And we can't all be successful maker cities. So it's about getting the culture right. But then I think it's completely possible. We're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was excellent.